Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next computer side chat. Today we are going to be focusing on executive departments and executive agencies. Now, as a short review, as we've talked about, the job of the executive branch is to carry out or execute the law. Now, to this point, we've really only focused on the presidency and the job of the presidency, the power of the presidency, and how he carries out this job of the executive branch. However, the president isn't the sole person in charge of doing this job of carrying out the law. So today we want to look at the other parts of the executive branch that are in charge of carrying out this role. So let's go ahead and dive in. So beyond the president and vice president, the executive branch is made up of departments and independent agencies. So let's talk about what each of those are. Departments are organizations that focus on a specific type of activity, such as education, the military, foreign policy, etc., etc. So these are entities or organizations that have a specific focus, and their job is to carry out the law or create regulation with regard to that specific area. Some examples of executive departments include the Department of Education, that's in charge of setting regulations and enforcing law that deals with education across the United States. The Department of State, which is in charge of conducting foreign policy and furthering our relationships with foreign nations. And then the Department of Justice, which is in charge of enforcing the law as well as administering justice. Overall, there are 15 federal departments, all with their own focus and with smaller agencies or bureaus underneath them. They are headed by individuals known as secretaries, and these secretaries take on the title of Secretary of whatever department they are in charge of. So Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Agriculture, so on and so forth. There is an exception to this, though. The head of the Department of Justice is known as the Attorney General, but he's also considered a secretary, even though his title technically is not secretary. These 15 individuals make up the President's Cabinet, and the President's Cabinet is the 15 individuals at the head of these departments who act as the chief advisors to the president on the issues that he must face. In other words, their job is to brief the president about what is going on within the realm of the department that they are in charge of. So what is going on in the world of education, in foreign affairs, in justice and enforcement of law, so on and so forth, and give the president advice in what measures he should take or how he can best support his executive departments. So you see around here on the screen some examples of these secretaries. So you have Betsy DeVos up in the top right-hand corner, who is the Secretary of Education. You have Mike Pompeo in the bottom right, who is the Secretary of State. And then over in the bottom left, you have William Barr, who is the Attorney General, or the head of the Department of Justice. So that wraps it up for departments. Let's go ahead and take a look at independent agencies now. Independent agencies are organizations that also have a specific focus. But the difference and key thing to understand with independent agencies is that they are independent of the influence of the president. In other words, whereas the Department of Education can be heavily influenced by the president himself, these independent agencies are free of presidential influence. While the president is in charge of appointing certain heads or leaders to these departments, those heads do not necessarily have to follow the exact orders of the president himself. They are able to work independently and even against the president's wishes if they so desire. Some examples of these independent agencies are the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, which is in charge of investigating and enforcing laws dealing with federal crimes within the United States. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is our investigative and intelligence bureau that deals with threats outside of the country. So, for example, terrorism. And then you also have FEMA, which is in charge of responding to natural disasters within the United States and providing aid to citizens in the event of an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane or so on and so forth. So these agencies, again, they act independently of the president. And sometimes that is because maybe what is the best decision for the country is not necessarily what the president wants, or with regards to a entity like the FBI, they often investigate wrongdoings by individuals within the United States. And so you have a critical thinking question. So think about why, especially a entity like the FBI, why it's probably a good idea that the FBI is free of presidential influence. So let's look at the carrying out the law part of this. And how do these agencies and departments actually factor into carrying out the law? So first off, it's important to understand, execution of the law often depends on the types of law that need to be carried out. In other words, there are different types of laws. Some laws require enforcement, while others require regulation. Let's talk about what we mean by that. First off, let's focus on enforcement. The types of laws associated with enforcement are laws that make things illegal and describe consequences for those who do those things. So that could be something like selling drugs, or murder, or being part of a terrorist organization or aiding a terrorist organization. In other words, we have very clear laws that stipulate that not only are these things illegal, but if you are caught doing these things, there are specific punishments that result as a consequence. There are 5 main actions involved with the practice of enforcement. First is educating the public about new laws. In other words, ensuring that the public actually knows what a certain law stipulates and how it affects them. One example of this would be something like healthcare.gov, which is the website that was created after Obamacare was put into effect. It helps educate people on what Obamacare is, as well as find healthcare plans that meet the standards necessary for falling in line with the parameters set out by the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare law. Next is monitor the public to make sure laws are being followed. So, in other words, while we're talking about federal bureaucracy and federal departments, if we were to talk about this on the local or state level, an example of this might be a cop car on patrol. By going on patrol, the police are monitoring a city or a town and looking for individuals that are possibly breaking the law. Next is catching individuals or organizations not following the law. This often takes the form of arresting these individuals. Next is taking offenders to court. In other words, passing those who have broken the law onto the judicial branch so they can be put on trial to be either found guilty or not guilty. And then lastly, follow any other enforcement procedures the agency may have. So in other words, often when a law is passed, not only are consequences associated with that law, but also parameters for how agencies like the FBI can go about enforcing that law. What is legal versus illegal in terms of enforcement. Next, let's take a look at regulations. So first off, let's talk about what types of laws are associated with regulation. These are laws that are just instructions about something that must be done, and these laws don't often give every detail on how that thing should be done. So let me explain that. In the last section we talked about enforcement, we talked about laws that specifically state that something is illegal, and if that thing is done, then there are specific punishments that come along with that. Those tend to be very black and white laws. However, there are also laws that do things such as stipulate or order certain entities to conduct themselves in a certain way or do certain things. So, for example, airport security. When you go to the airport and you have your plane ticket to get on a plane and go somewhere, you don't just walk through the front door and get on your plane. Generally, there's a whole security apparatus that you have to go through before you can board the plane. When Congress passed a law stipulating that airports must have a certain level of security, they don't put exact details on what every single airport should have. Instead, these laws stipulate that the executive branch will decide on those details, and these details are known as regulations. So in other words, Congress might pass a law saying that airports must have a certain level of security to prevent threats and to maintain safety aboard planes. And then they would pass that on to the executive branch, and it would be up to the department or agency within the executive branch, such as, say, the Department of Homeland Security, to determine what that looks like. In other words, you must have metal detectors at the airport. You must have random individual screenings of individuals. There are certain things that cannot be brought on a plane, and so on and so forth. In other words, regulations are the tiny details and rules that are made within the framework of a law passed by Congress. Some other common places where regulations are seen are things like pollution. How much pollution can a factory or company create? What regulations or rules are there for disposal of hazardous materials, and so on and so forth. Another area would be something like work safety. What parameters must be taken by companies to ensure that their workers are safe? And then relevant to you guys that are going to be going on to college, after you graduate from Marysville, is regulations regarding things like student loan debt, in terms of what is the maximum amount of interest that you can be charged for student loans. How long must you be given between the time that you graduate to when you actually have to start paying those loans back. So those are all examples of regulations. And again, they're the tiny rules within the framework of a given law. So that's a real short explanation of how federal agencies and federal departments enforce the law and carry out the job of the executive branch. Tomorrow we will obviously take our quiz in class, talk a little bit more about this, ensure that we are all on the same page before moving on. Have a great day. I will see you guys tomorrow.